Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler on the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Tom Segev, who is a historian and a columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. His publications include Elvis in Jerusalem, Post-Zionism and the Americanization of Israel, One Palestine Complete, Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate, and The Seventh Million, the Israelis and the Holocaust. Tom, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Jerusalem, and I grew up in Jerusalem. My parents came from Germany to what was then Palestine. They were refugees from Nazi Germany. My father was killed in the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948 when I was 3 years old. And I grew up in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. And how did that background, that is that your parents came from Germany, your father died when you were, how did that shape your thinking about the world as you were growing up?
Well, first of all, I was, like most Israelis in those days, a child of immigrants. I mean, immigration is never easy. So, for example, my first language was German. I spoke German with my mother at home. And only then, at the age of 3 or 5 or 6, or whenever you start going out at the street, I learned Hebrew. So, and interestingly enough, my mother never learned Hebrew because many, perhaps most Jews who came from Germany never learned Hebrew properly. So she really couldn't read what I was writing in the newspapers or my books. I have a dedication in one of my books where I say, the English edition of it, where I dedicate it to my mother, and I say, finally she can read it. Because like many of the first Israelis, she never learned to read Hebrew.
And what, as you were growing up, in addition to the War of Independence, which you may or may not have remembered, what events really that Israel went through really stick in your mind from that?
The first war I can remember is the War of 1956, the Sinai campaign or the Suez campaign. I can remember that. And I can remember a number of times fear of war. I can remember, obviously, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War and everything that came after that. And I served in the army, but I never got to kill anybody. Served at the National Defense College in my compulsory army service. But I can remember fear, and I know now what I didn't know then, that it was a very European fear. You know, people bring with them their culture and their fear. And I really grew up to believe that we have lost a better life in Europe. And I think that's typical of many immigrants. They always tell you that life abroad was better life. Now, many Israelis never wanted to live in Israel. They would have much rather stayed at home. My parents would have much rather stayed in Germany, but they couldn't. So many Israelis were raised with a feeling that life abroad was actually a better life. And I remember that at times my mother would radiate some kind of fear of a war which really wasn't our war. It was a European war. Like she would buy foodstuffs and things which are really unnecessary in Israel. You know, even the wars are very short, and there's no need to buy rice and sugar and things. And she would do that because she kind of lived the previous war, and I didn't know that.
And she had come. They had come to you to Israel after World War II, or
no?
when?
They had come in 1935. 35. So they had actually experienced, including World War II scare in Palestine. There was a time when the people in Palestine, the Jews of Palestine, feared that the Nazi army might invade Palestine. So war to her was a very, I would almost say it was part of her identity. And I think that's probably a very Israeli thing. I mean, war for us is very much part of our identity. So somebody like me really grew up from war to war. And to me, the most important war is the war, the Six-Day War, 1967. To some other people, it's 1973. In fact, you can sometimes detect a person's age by what they mean when they say the war. Mm-hmm. They say, this was during the war. You ask them, yes, what? We have 7 or 8 wars, and you ask them exactly what war, and then you know how old they are.
Before we talk about Israel and its self-conception, let's trace your background a little more. Where were you educated, and then why did you decide to go into history?
I was educated in Israel, went to elementary school and the Hebrew University High School, and I studied history at the Hebrew University, and then I went to Boston University to do my PhD, mostly because I wanted to be in America for a while. And I was also fascinated by something which was then called psychohistory, which is out, I think, but in the 70s it was very, very much in. And
Erik Erikson. And
right. And in Boston, of course, it was very much in. And so the feeling that you might be able to understand Nazi Germany just by crossing the hall and asking somebody at the psychology department, excuse me, why do they kill the Jews? And they will tell you, oh, because they're mothers and you know. So we tried psychohistory, and it was a very exciting thing to do. I always wanted to be a journalist, and I'm very skeptical about the possibility of being a journalist, because a journalist almost never really goes to the final details of the truth. Now, if you do history, you know so much more. I have the documents. Mm-hmm. If I do journalism, I can ask the foreign minister, what did you say in that conference, and what did Mr. Arafat say in that conference? And they will tell you the truth or not. Probably not. If you have the documents, that's you feel that you have the stories. So I feel very much that history and journalism is very much the same thing for me. I think the best journalism is historic journalism, and the best history is journalistic history.
And how does this synergy work between these two crafts, so to speak? Does what's going on in today's world in Israel, what you're reporting as a Haaretz writer, does that affect or influence when you go back into the archives and the kinds of problems you work with? It
influences in the sense that it dictates the questions to me. Mm-hmm. I feel that the situation today is so complicated and so difficult to understand that you really need to go back to the origins of the conflict in order to understand what it is. What is it all about? Why are we killing each other? And so I think that sometimes you might understand it better if you go back to the origins of the conflict. Now, Israel is, of course, a very, very complex society, very, very deeply divided society. And it's a very exciting society. It's a very exciting country to be a journalist in. It's also a very exciting country to study. The history of it is very, very exciting and challenging. And so that's why I like doing both things. I sometimes think that I would have loved to be older and cover 1949. Establishment of Israel, 1948, to cover that story. Wow, that would be a great story to cover. So I couldn't, but I could write a book about it. So I felt as if I'm covering it as a journalist.
Now you were called one of the new historians in Israel.
Right.
Who are the new historians, and how do they contribute to the dialogue in Israel?
Most of the new historians are elderly gentlemen by now, because it's an old story.
I see.
It started really, I think, 15 years ago, or perhaps even before that.
That doesn't make you old.
No, it really all started when Israel started to open official archives. And Israel has a relatively liberal policy of opening archives, more liberal than other countries. Not liberal enough for my taste, but more liberal than other countries. And so 20 or 15 years ago, it became possible to write Israeli history. Before that, we didn't have Israeli history. We had mythology, we had ideology, we had a lot of official indoctrination, but we didn't really know what happened. Now, the new historians are really the first historians. They are people who go to the archives, you take out a file, you look at the document, and you say, wow, this is not the way I learned it at school. It's all different. They lied to me. And so this is why 15 years ago, all these books had such a shocking effect, because many people said, this is not what we learned at school. And I think this is typical for a young nation, and it's part of nation building that the establishment would try to shape history and dictate history and provide some kind of national mythology. But once you go to the documents, you see what they really talked about in closed sessions. You say, you know, this is completely different. So a group of us started to look at those documents and write these books. Some of them are connected to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and some deal with other subjects. But it all turned out to be very relevant for today, because the problems are the same. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about the discrimination of people who came from Arab countries to Israel, for example, the non-Ashkenazic Jews, this is still very relevant today. When you talk about corruption in government, when you talk about a government that lies to the people, it's about the same subjects we are dealing with today. Mm-hmm. And so it's all very relevant, and that's why it is so shocking. History in Israel is politics. Mm. And history in Israel has an existential importance. And so that's why these people were called new historians. But in the meantime, I think they were really first historians. In the meantime, we have new historians. These are the ones who prove that we, the first historians, were wrong, mm-hmm. or argue with us, or say, well, it's really not that bad, or, you know, they have more documents, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, so let's talk about what some of these recurring themes are, because as you just said, in looking at several of your books, I do get the sense that the same issues about Israel, who are the Israelis? I mean, what is their relation to the diaspora? What is their relation to the Holocaust? That these questions recur again and again, and as you just said, part of the politics of the today really is to try to reshape the issues as the debate continues.
There is a debate on who is a Jew, of course, and there's no answer. We don't know who is a Jew. It's very, very difficult to define. There is more than one legal definition, and there are religious definitions, several religious definitions. There are historical definitions, cultural definitions. Who is a Jew? It is very, very difficult, particularly in a country that understands itself as a Jewish country. But we have a great number of debates on very basic existential questions. We really have a cultural war going on in Israel, and it has been going on for a very long time. It's a cultural war in the German sense, a Kulturkampf, a conflict between basic values of a society. We have not yet decided what kind of society we want to be. Originally, we wanted to be a European society. Zionism was born in Europe, and was hoping to establish a European country in the Middle East. It didn't work out mostly because most of those people who were supposed to come and live in Israel, in Europe, they were killed by the Nazis. And so the Zionist movement had to look elsewhere and found the Jews of the Arab countries. They completely changed the nature of Israel. And then it turned out that it is much more difficult to make peace with the Palestinian Arabs than the founding fathers of the country had believed. So we have problems of being Jewish and democratic. As I said before, we are a deeply divided country in the sense that we have so many people from so many different countries. People in Israel speak 90 languages. It's a very, or over 100 languages. It's a very small country. And you have a tremendous diversity of people. And it's very, very difficult to shape them into one nation. As you said yourself, we constantly argue about our relationship with Jews in other countries. According to the Zionist ideology, we want them all to come and live in Israel. So we have a problem. Do we want to protect their rights as Jews living in other countries? Or are we interested in anti-Semitism that would make them all come to Israel? It's very difficult. We tended in the past, we don't do that anymore, but we tended in the past to understand ourselves as people who are completely different than the traditional Jew. We actually looked down at the traditional Jew. We thought that we are better people. We are biblical heroes. We are not part of the diaspora. We wanted to be, the term used in those days was a new man, which is a concept that really comes from Soviet Russia, Weimar Germany, fascist Italy, some kind of combination. We would be, we the new men. We don't, we are upright and strong and patriotic. We have a country to defend. We have honor. We don't deal in business, small businesses like the Jews of the diaspora. We look down at the Jews of the diaspora. One of the things that happened to us over the years is that we understood that you cannot wipe out 2,000 years of history. Mm-hmm. And so Israelis became more Jewish all the time, in the sense that they learned to identify with Jewish history, with the Jewish tragedy, with the fact that some Jews don't live in Israel. And it's legitimate not to live in Israel. Of course, many Israelis don't live in Israel anymore. And they continue to be Israelis. So all these are very, very complicated issues of identity. It all goes back to the question, who is an Israeli? Who is a Jew? What is it we want to be? How do we live with a large Arab minority in Israel? Not the Palestinians outside, Israeli Palestinians. How do we live with them? How do we remain a Jewish state and a democratic state? How do we do that? So these are all tremendous problems, and they are constantly being discussed, and they are part of our everyday lives, part, almost you might say, of the Israeli identity. Mm-hmm. It's a very Israeli thing to constantly tackle and argue about issues of identity.
And so this is why in your book on the Holocaust, the 7 million Israelis and the Holocaust, it's an account of Israel, the Israelis' evolving view, basically, of what that event was, yes, and what its meaning was. And in fact, I think I have a quote here. Somewhere in the book, you're talking about the Zionist movement and its efforts to decide how to deal, or whether they should deal with the Nazi regime. This would be in the 30s. Yes. And you write that, and the question was, would they negotiate Havara agreements, that is, agreements for transferring Jews to Israel. And you write, Ben-Gurion saw the debate between rescue and boycott of Nazis as a debate between Zionism and assimilation, between national interest of Jewish settlement in Palestine and the international war against anti-Semitism, and so on. So the same problems existed back then, really, as Israel...
Not in the same intensity. This is, of course, a unique moment in history, mm-hmm, and it's a very tragic, it's more than embarrassing, it's actually a very tragic moment for the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement should have rescued the Jews, but it couldn't. It was too weak. Mm-hmm. And so the Zionist movement just had to watch how 6 million Jews are being slaughtered. They knew what's going on, they knew what's happening. They actually talked about 7 million Jews who would be killed while most of the Holocaust survivors were still alive. So they knew that they have lost all these and they are helpless to do anything, which is a very, very tragic moment for a national movement, which the whole existence of the movement was based on the assumption that it will rescue the Jews. And that's a question somebody has to ask. Some people have asked themselves after the Holocaust, are we still Jewish? But obviously many people have asked themselves, are we still Zionists? And the Zionist movement had a lot of explaining to do. How come we didn't rescue the Jews? And that became a very, very central and very, very painful issue in Israeli politics, because some of the opposition parties accused the ruling parties, this is all pre-state, but it was really the same. They accused them, you have not done enough to save the Jews. My answer I really wrote a book, a lot about that in my book, and my answer is that they really couldn't. It's really a story of helplessness of the Zionist movement. But it's a very, very painful issue. It was a painful issue. It was more than an historical issue. It was really a question of people coming out of the Holocaust, arriving in Palestine, and facing the leadership and ask them, why didn't you do something for us? And what do you say? I mean, so that's a terrible, a terrible moment. And this is one of the reasons why, in the 50s, Israelis tended to ignore the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a taboo. People wouldn't talk about it to their children. Children wouldn't dare to ask. This was a period of the big silence. The Holocaust almost didn't exist. It's only gradually, over the years, at the beginning of the 60s, that people began to dare to talk about their own experiences and also the historical issues. And gradually, over the years, Israelis learned to identify with the tragedy of the Holocaust, with the victims of the Holocaust. Again, I think this is part of becoming more Jewish.
And a key turning point in this was the trial of Adolf Eichmann.
Yes, in the 1960s. The trial of Adolf Eichmann really worked as collective therapy for an entire nation, because for the first time the state was interested in the stories of the survivors. The survivors had stories to tell which nobody wanted to listen to before. But during the trial, the state and the people became interested, and there was a demand for accounts. And so the Eichmann trial really started a very slow process for Israelis learning to live with the Holocaust.
And I guess this change involved making the Holocaust part of Israel's national story, basically.
Yes, the Holocaust
as an account that had to be addressed, and that somehow Israel was, through the trial, the kidnapping of Eichmann, through its presentation of his conviction and his hanging, presenting that to the world, making clear that it was through Israel that justice was being implemented.
Yes.
Is that, and that's a turning point really for Israel, isn't it? Or?
That's a turning point. Also, the ability to do so. It's the victim who discovers his ability to, if you want to revenge, if you want to punish, if you want to do justice. There was even some debate on whether or not to execute him in Israel. That deeply divided we are. Some people even said, let's not execute him. But over the years, the Holocaust became a very central element of the Israeli identity. If you ask somebody today, what is it to be an Israeli, I would say the first thing is to speak Hebrew. And it's the language that is very important. To me, it's more important than actually living in Israel. As long as you speak the language which is spoken nowhere else, as long as your language is Hebrew, you are an Israeli. And I would say the second thing is a feeling for Jewish history, and that would mean the Holocaust. And for many, many Israelis, the Holocaust has become a very, very central element of identity. There's not a single day without at least some newspaper mentioning the Holocaust. There's also the Israeli high school kids who go to Poland today to visit the extermination camps. When I grew up, we wouldn't talk about the Holocaust. We wouldn't even dream of going anywhere to look at, and today tens of thousands of Israeli high school kids are going to Poland to visit the extermination camp. And the interesting thing about it is that the families have to pay for it. It's not the schools taking the kids to Poland. No, it costs a lot of money. It costs like maybe $1,500 for each family to send the boy or the son or daughter to Poland. They feel a need to do that. And so this is quite amazing if you look at it historically.
Now, what are the implications for that as Israel deals with its strategic environment? Because by bringing the Holocaust to the center of Israeli national identity, it must impact, feed upon the insecurity that Israel feels being in a part of the world where it is threatened by all of its neighbors, essentially. Yes. Talk a little about that dynamic, because
it's difficult. It's difficult because everybody uses the Holocaust for every purpose, in every argument. So obviously the government uses the Holocaust in order to prove that Israel is in danger and that the whole world has a responsibility to help us and stand by us. Some governments, for example, the government headed by Menachem Begin, Prime Minister Begin, went so far as to say, you, the world, you can't tell us what's right and wrong. We can't do wrong because we are victims. And even if we kill Palestinians, it's not for you to tell us because you didn't prevent the Holocaust. You can be a government, or it can be a newspaper, can be the Times of London, can be CNN, BBC. Don't tell us what to do. We are the victims, and we will continue to be the victims. Now, of course, there are people on the left who use the Holocaust. They say, I don't go to serve on the occupied territories because this is what I learned from the Holocaust. So people on the left and people on the right use it. Now, the difficult thing is to distinguish between genuine Holocaust feelings and manipulated Holocaust arguments. And I sometimes think that if you develop the ability to make that distinction, then you really hold in your hand a key to the understanding of the Israeli society. You have both. You have Prime Minister Begin writing a letter to President Reagan saying, I'm sending the Israeli army to capture Adolf Hitler in his bunker in Beirut, meaning Yasser Arafat. So that would be clear manipulation. But you have a small country like Israel making an historic decision to build an atomic bomb. Why? Why do we need an atomic bomb? There's only one explanation. The explanation is there must never be a second Holocaust. Otherwise, you cannot understand why Israel needs an atomic bomb. It really doesn't. But this is why we started to build one. So this is genuine. And you have genuine feelings in the population. I'm writing now a book on 1967. Now, on the eve of the Six-Day War, I think the municipality of Tel Aviv sent rabbis out to public parks to sanctify them, expecting thousands and thousands of victims in the war that was only a few days away. I think that only a country that has experienced a previous Holocaust can prepare so meticulously to the next Holocaust. That's true. That's genuine. That's not manipulation. And it's very difficult to know when do we manipulate the Holocaust and when it's genuine.
Now, this touches on another dilemma, another tension, another continuing debate in Israel, which is the debate about Israel's relation to the world community of Jews, basically.
Yes.
And in a way, after reading your work, it is as if Israel cannot decide whether it will be saved by the Jewish community of the world or whether it will be its savior. And this is a tension that exists throughout the history of Zionism and into the present. In your book called One Palestine Complete, about Palestine during the British occupation, it's very clear that there was a division within the Balfour, within the cabinet that issued the Balfour Declaration about what the position of Jews in England should be about Israel.
There was one Jewish member, there were two Jewish members of the British cabinet. One of them was against the Balfour Declaration, which expressed support for the establishment of the Jews.
This was Montague?
Yes, Montague. He was against a policy that would support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The reason being, I'm British. I belong here. How can you tell me that my place is in another country? This is my country, Britain. And of course, Zionists had a great difficulty to recognize that some Jews are Jews and live in other countries. And it is even the obligation of the Zionist movement to fight for rights of Jews in other countries. And today I think we are very sensitive to anti-Semitism, which is rising, for example, in Europe. But again, it's difficult to know where is it genuine and where is it manipulation. I mean, we tend to say that every criticism of the government of Ariel Sharon is anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. We say these are anti-Semites, these people in L'Express or the BBC or CNN or whatever. They are criticizing Sharon, so they must be anti-Semites, which is of course nonsense. But we manipulate the rise of anti-Semitism for our purposes. When I say we, I mean the government of Israel does. And so, again, it's difficult to know when are we genuinely worried because of instances of anti-Semitism. And we are worried. So it is not as if we say, well, you have a very simple alternative. Come home to Israel. If you don't want to be persecuted as a Jew in your country, all you need to do is to come to Israel. We don't say that anymore, I think. We have recognized that Jews live in other countries, and we feel that we have an obligation to save Jews. Of course, we like to do dramatic rescue operations like the rescue operation of the Jews of Ethiopia and things like that. This gives us a very good feeling that we are protecting the Jews everywhere. We also tell ourselves very often, this is a very frequently used cliche, if the state of Israel had existed in the 30s, the Holocaust would be impossible. I don't think that's true at all, but it is a very frequent thing to say in Israel. And again, it reflects our attitude towards the Jews in the diaspora. It is we are supposed to defend them, to protect them.
So as a journalist / historian, how does one work at bringing light to the confusion that surrounds criticism of the Sharon government and confuses it with anti-Semitism against the Jewish people on the one hand, versus it merely just being a criticism of the particular policies of this particular government at this particular time in Israel?
If you are a leftist journalist, you do it one way. If you are a rightist journalist, you do it this other way. It all depends. I mean, this is all part of Israeli politics.
And you're not afraid to talk about it, though, and debate
about Israeli politics? I'm not afraid to talk about it.
But Israelis generally, too, right?
Oh, nobody is a Salman Rushdie in Israel. We don't have any Salman Rushdies in Israel. You can say whatever you want. You can talk about it. I also don't buy the distinction some people make that you cannot say things abroad which you say at home. Sometimes you cannot say everything because people won't understand what you mean, so you need to explain what are you actually saying because they don't have enough information. But the world is an open world and a small world, and what you say in Hebrew, you can say in any other language. For example, when the 7 million was about to be translated into German, many people asked me, won't you be embarrassed? Mm-hmm. I said, I won't be embarrassed, because if it's true in one language, it's true in another language. So that's the way I talk about Israeli politics. I really say abroad whatever I say at home.
One of your books is called Elvis in Jerusalem, and it really focuses on the very special relationship between the United States and Israel. Let's talk about that a little. What impact has this relationship had on Israeli culture, for example?
One of the things that happened to Israel is that it has become very Americanized, and it is still in a process of Americanization. And that really stems, I think, from the overall strategic situation. We are being supported by the United States. We belong to the sphere of influence of the United States. We get support, financial support, military support, political support. And over the years, we have learned to identify very much with the American culture. We used to be very much part of the European culture, at one point even of the Eastern European, of the socialist world. And we have learned to become part of the American of the American culture, which means that we have only lunch, small lunches and big dinners, and we walk around with these buttons on our shirts, and even the Hebrew language is heavily influenced by the American language. We used to say shalom when we come. We don't say that anymore. We say hi. We used to say shalom when we go. We don't say that anymore. We say bye. And so we are very Americanized today. We're also American, and I think it's a good thing, because Americanization for Israel brings constitutionalism and pluralism and democracy, accountability of government, more efficiency, and so on. It also brings one thing which I think we have overdone that, and that's the free market economy, which has really led to a situation where the gap between rich and poor in Israel is deeper, in fact, than it is in this country. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have a real problem there. Our economy, we have taken it, I think, too fast in the American direction. We become, in a way, a very cruel society. We used to be a very social democratic. The concepts of social democratic solidarity is something that really belongs in the past. If you talk to a man like Benjamin Netanyahu, who of course is one of the symbols of the Israeli Americanization, if you talk to him, then you don't hear the same voice of Israel you would hear 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. You really hear the voice of America coming from him.
In your book on One Palestine, Whole and Complete, you mentioned at some point the debate within British and Zionist circles about, well, the Jews should get a homeland in Palestine because it would be an outpost for the West, basically. Yes. And yes. This is an argument that one hears here in the United States in the debate about American policy toward Israel and so on. What should we make of that argument? I mean, was it valid back in the period with the British, and is it valid today?
I don't know if you have an interest to keep an outpost, a Western outpost in the Middle East in the cultural sense. The British definitely had that interest, and the Zionist movement had that interest. The Zionist movement really thought of itself as a European movement, and the country would be a European country. So I don't know that you really care for that, but the fact is that Israel has become Americanized also in the sense that all elites in Israel are manned today by people who have an American chapter in their biography. So the economy, the academics, the science, business, the army, politics, the media, of course. The elites are people who studied in America. And at least at the time, I don't know that the United States is still pursuing that policy, but at the time, the United States actively supported that. There were funds who would support that, as they do for developing countries. This would be in the battle in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. For example, yes, for example, just the way you would support American movies and American books and American music. But the book is called Elvis in Jerusalem because on the way to Jerusalem there is a big statue, over life size, of Elvis Presley standing there. There is in fact a sign. If you turn right, you go to Elvis, turn left, you go to Jerusalem. I mean, what can be more American than that? And I think some people resent that. Not many. One of the things that is unique about Israel is that we never had a really strong anti-American sentiment in Israel. Some people resent particularly the Hebrew language. To me, by the way, the Hebrew language is being enriched by their whole grammatical constructions that come to us from the English. And I feel that Hebrew has become a more sophisticated language as a result of the American influence. But of course we have some purists like in France or in other countries in Europe who resent the Americanization of the Hebrew language. I really feel that so far the English language has had a good effect on the Hebrew language.
What do you think your books of history about Israel, what might they contribute to the American debate about its relations with Israel, and in particular the Jewish debate within the United States about well, just that the level of support, the uncritical, in other words, should American Jews be more critical of particular Israeli policies?
I see.
Should American foreign policy be more critical of particular policies of a particular Israeli government?
Yes, I think both questions I answered them in the first. First of all, I think that one of the things which I find difficult to understand about the attitude of American Jews to Israel is that they tend to support every government. Even if it's an evil government, like the government we have today. The Sharon government is really an evil government, but they support it because they say it's been democratically elected and it's not for us to decide who is ruling the Israelis. They also very often identify Israel with the government of Israel. They say this is an anti-Israeli statement. Why? Because it is criticizing Sharon. And I am saying, no, it's a very pro-Israeli statement if it criticizes Sharon. And so I sometimes say to Jews in America, give us the benefit you require for yourself. You don't identify the United States with Mr. Bush. Tomorrow you will have another president. It's not the same thing. The government and the country is not the same thing. You can consider yourself a friend of Israel, a supporter of Israel, but be very critical of policies which you would criticize for your own government. Israel now has a policy of systematically violating the human rights of the Palestinians. If you are for it, be for it. But if you are against it, don't hide your criticism because it is Israel doing or because other people are criticizing it. It's okay to criticize the government of Israel. It's not the same thing as saying Israel should not exist. And that's something which American Jews hesitate to do, many of them hesitate to do. Now, as to the U.S. government, I really feel that the U.S. government should treat Israel, not let Israel do whatever it wants to do, right? For the last 3 years, we have a situation where President Bush really lets Sharon do whatever he wants. Of course, it's more difficult nowadays to come and require that the United States protect human rights. You have invaded Iraq, you have a concentration camp in Guantanamo, so who are you to talk about human rights? of course. But I still feel that we won't get anywhere in the Middle East unless the United States actively intervenes and not supports whatever the government of Israel feels that it wants to do.
How do you account for this lack of refinement, of the poor quality of the analysis, which I agree with you the Jewish community is guilty of, and of course American foreign policy, that's different because that's more of a political problem. But what is it, this confusion about Israel as a state in the Middle East versus Israel as the Jewish state in the Middle East, this confusion that always revolves around Israel about it being a state versus being the center of world Jewry in its own eyes?
Well, I think basically I think there is a certain amount of laziness here. People don't want to take the responsibility. They don't want to be involved. They want to support Israel the easiest way. It's not easy to support Israel, but they want easy way support. I think that's what reflects the basic attitude. They don't want to be part of Israeli politics. They don't want to be part of the Israeli debate. They don't want to say, I support the dismantlement of settlements because I am for Israel. They feel guilty about their wish to see that Israel withdraws from the territories, because it has become an anti-Israeli, which of course it isn't. It's the most supportive thing for Israel to say, get out of these territories. But they don't see it that way because it contradicts the policy of the government of Israel. And so the easiest way is to say this is a democratically elected government, and so we support Israel and we support its government. But I really think it's wrong. I understand it. It's the easy way. It's more difficult. People in America have enough problems about deciding whether to elect this president or that president, and so they don't want to be part of the politics of another country. They may also be afraid of what the famous issue of dual loyalty. If they feel too strongly about the politics of another country, somebody might say, well, you don't really belong here. You are not fully American. You're really, this is all very, very complicated for American Jews, and I understand that. It's only that I very often feel that with more support of Americans for the right issues in Israel, Israel might be a better country than it is now.
And how would one...
If you wouldn't let us do whatever we feel we want to do, I mean, you would really restrain us. We need America to restrain us.
And what is the way to help that happen? Is it through works of history? Is it through reading Haaretz, your paper? What? Because it seems to be a real bottleneck.
You're making a paper boy now and distributing my newspaper, okay?
Just free, not trying for free advertising, but no. I mean, I as somebody who's interested in U.S. foreign policy and has come to follow the internal dynamics of Israel, finds Haaretz informative in a way that one doesn't find in the American press or in the American Jewish press, about the dynamics, the tensions, the conflict, the possibilities.
Haaretz is actually a unique journalistic creation. I mean, it's a quality newspaper. Many countries don't have that kind of newspaper, or many large countries have only one. You have the New York Times, and most other newspapers are trying to follow that example. And so it's quite surprising that a small country like Israel, a country that is increasingly becoming less European and more Americanized, still has this very European, very quality daily newspaper, which doesn't go for sensations, doesn't go for emotions, really tries to analyze. And it's very difficult to edit and publish a newspaper like that in days of television, because you constantly have to decide, what do I add to what the people already saw last night on television? And so it's not easy. but it is surviving. It is not making a lot of money, but it is surviving.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is a unique cultural creation among other cultural creations of Israel. We still have a lot of things to be proud of in Israeli culture, and I think that Haaretz is definitely one of them.
And so how do you bring the dynamic that's present in that paper to inform the understanding of the Jewish debate within the United States about Israel? Just read Haaretz.
You can, just read Haaretz. I mean, you can read it on the internet.
Yeah, which I do.
And lots and lots of people do read it, form your opinion, and dare to make the distinction between the government of Israel and between the state of Israel. It is not impossible. It is not something you don't do for your own country. Mm-hmm. Do it for us as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are not the same. Israel is not Ariel Sharon. And so it's terribly important that you make that distinction.
Now what is a final question? What is the answer with regard to the Arab world and the Palestinians? Because we are in a box now where the tendencies within Israel, because of the non-responsiveness up until this point on the other side with regard to making peace with Israel, recognizing the right of Israel to exist, seems not to happen, and therefore Israel is placed in an environment in which all these ambivalences, all of these fears, the fears that you talked about at the beginning of the interview, come into play and seem to have a reality to them.
And they become even more of a reality as a result of terrorism.
Yeah.
Because terrorism really harms people's ability and willingness to think rationally. And it happens not only to rightist people, it happens to leftist people like myself. I sit with equally liberal people in a cafe, and we talk peace, we talk human rights, we talk dismantlement of the settlements and withdrawal from territories and Palestinian state and all these beautiful things. And if you are lucky, the cafe doesn't blow up while you are there, but only after you left. So you feel stupid. It happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so you feel stupid. Whom am I talking to? I basically think that the conflict with the Palestinians doesn't have a solution at this time. It's not something we can solve, and I think we should not talk about solving it. It's all about management. The big argument is, how do you manage the conflict? We do not have a solution to the refugee problem at this time. We do not have an acceptable solution to the problem of the settlements. We do not have an acceptable solution to the problem of Jerusalem. But we can manage the conflict in a much, much more rational way, in a much, much more better way. And I think that we should do that even while terrorism is going on, because we should not let every 16-year-old suicide kid dictate the whole Middle East agenda to us. Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult to do. But Haaretz is one of the voices that advocates rationalism.
Well, one final question. How would you advise students to prepare for the future insofar as they're thinking about Israel, they want to understand Israel's situation and how it might fit in?
Read the best Israeli newspaper, which is the New York Times, and read the second best Israeli newspaper, which is Haaretz.
Mm-hmm. And as a historian, do you have any advice for them other than your books?
Read many books. I mean, there are lots of books out on Israel. It's very easy to get informed about Israel. And I think the more you know, the more rational you are bound to think. And that's why it's very important to know a lot. It's not really about opinionated books or opinionated statements. It's really about the information.
On that note, Mr. Segev, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.